Thanks, Carol. Well, hello. It's particularly given how pretty it is outside, it's great to see there are a few people who are still interested in history and where a lot of the ideas that permeate our culture really came from. 2001 is an amazing movie, screenplay, book. It's become one of the major set of icons for our culture. And yet, very few people, I think, really appreciate the 50-year history that is encapsulated in the story of HAL, the computer, in 2001. I want to thank, before I forget it, a few people that have helped me try to reconstruct the last 5 decades of work here at Illinois, which I'm going to give you a brief outline of. Dan Alpert and Judy Tolliver, Jim Kaler, Duncan Laurie, Carol Miniker. And I'm going to take you through 3 major periods, 3 dates really. 1948, roughly 50 years ago. That's where you have to go to really understand the birthplace of HAL, why, and then 1968, when the book was written, Clark decided to put the birthplace in Urbana. And then finally, 1997, the year that HAL supposedly was born. And I think one of the questions we all have is, how could Clark be so prophetic about so many things and so accurate, and yet be so wrong about 1997 being the year that human-level intelligence computers are not only exist, but are deployable in spaceships? Something that is very far from the case. So why is that? Well, let's go back to HAL himself. As you saw in the movie, HAL, the quote from the book actually is, I am a HAL 9000 computer production number 3. I became operational at the HAL plant in Urbana, Illinois on January 12, 1997. But that's not the last time that Clark talks about Urbana in his novels. How many of you know the other Clark novel in which Urbana is explicitly mentioned? Right. Well, Clark wrote another book, The Hammer of God, about a possible collision of a comet in 2110, about a little over 100 years from now. And the spaceship's efforts, the descendants of the Discovery, in this case the Goliath, to try to stop it. And of course, I won't spoil the book for you because it's actually a very good book. They try to send off a missile with a nuclear warhead to blow it up, and that doesn't work, and all hope is lost, so the Goliath decides to go in and do it itself. And the night before the encounter with the comet called Kali, they notice that they're trying to use the computer on board, and it's very slow and they don't know what's going on, so they ask the computer, who's called David. David is a descendant of HAL, what was going on last night. And David said, well, I was just taking precautions. I've downloaded myself into Jonathan, my twin, in Urbana, Illinois. I downloaded 108.5 terabytes in 3.25 hours, which I work out to be 74 gigabits per second. Quite a bit faster than we're doing now, but quite a bit slower than they'll actually be doing it in 2110. So the notion that Clark had, not only that Urbana made sense for HAL to be born, but then later on in his novels, I think he understands very much the fact that in many eyes Urbana is really the center of the world for things involving supercomputers and has been so for 50 years. HAL himself has a lot of capabilities that I won't go into. He's able, obviously, to have computer-generated voice. He can recognize voice, and in particular, he can understand spoken language and decipher it. He has a lot of what we call artificial intelligence. He's capable of reasoning, lip reading. He's often referred to as the nervous system of the ship, so he's clearly a distributed computer tied into all sorts of sensors and actuators into the control structure of the ship. And interestingly enough, Hal, as you can see in the movie, this sort of red video photocell, video camera looking at you, most of Hal's communications with his shipmates were by means of the spoken word. And Clark really had this very clear sense of language as being the way that we interact with computers. And in particular, he missed most of virtual environments, which actually are very rapidly becoming the way that humans interact with computers, including your 8-year-olds using Nintendo 64. It's an interesting thing that Star Trek very much picked up on with the holodeck and the ability for computers to directly interact with people by creating virtual environments. Many of you know that Hal is apocryphally IBM with each letter shifted once, right? Now Clark vehemently denies that he did this intentionally, although the odds against it being a coincidence are 26 cubed. So maybe he'll be asked one more time about that Friday when we have the live hookup with him. There's two completely different stories about why Hal was born here. One is the literal story, which is about Professor McVitie, which I'll go into some more detail with you. It's about the notion of great science, that is scientific research that is done at this university and has been done at this university most of this century. The second one is a more metaphorical interpretation of why Hal was born in Urbana, which really has to do with its leadership in the sort of high-performance computer that Hal would have had to have been to be able to do what he does over 50 years, and in particular the intertwining of computer science and engineering, the scientific researchers who use computers in chemistry and engineering and physics and astronomy, and then a university administration, which, as I'll indicate to you, for 50 years has supported this campus being at the leading edge of computing. So I'm going to start with the real reason, and I'm going to take us again through these. We're going to keep coming back to these dates: 1948, 20 years later, 1968, and 30 years later, 1997. Now, Professor George McVitie is the real center of why Clark himself says that Hal was born in Urbana. He says, and I quote, "My applied maths tutor at King's College, Cambridge, where I took my degree in 1947 to 48, was the distinguished cosmologist George McVitie. He taught me the elements of perturbation theory, which I've used in several of my stories. During the 1950s, George moved to the U.S., where he took up a post at the University of Illinois in Urbana. I was happy to pay this fitting tribute to him, for I'm sure he must have been involved in establishing the Supercomputer Center at Urbana. A few months ago, I came across a photograph of the now famous Bletchley Park team that was responsible for breaking the Enigma cipher. That's the German secret code that our breaking of was one of the key reasons we won World War II. There in the middle was Alan Turing, the famous computer scientist, and standing shyly in the back was George McVitie. So it's clear that George, even though he was an astronomer and a cosmologist, and a very pure cosmologist at that, nonetheless, during the war, had been very involved with the highest performance of computers. During World War II, not only did the digital computer, was it basically invented during that period, but there were three main applications. One was calculating the trajectory of ballistic shells, so you could figure out where they'd land. Two was deciphering codes, and 3 was the beginnings of the use to help design the atom bomb. It turns out that for many years afterwards, in fact, to this day, the largest amount of money expended on supercomputers by this country, by the government, has been in those same 3 areas. And it was only in the last, well, since NCSA really was formed, about 1985, that a broad distribution of supercomputer technology throughout the society really began. So McVitie was this professor in 1948 teaching Clark about the elements of perturbation theory, how orbits are perturbed by gravity, right? Well, there's another thing that happened in 1948, and I'll try to relate this because I've sort of gotten enmeshed in this maze somehow my whole life. I was born. So I always think this sort of, sets the scale. While Clark is off learning orbital mechanics from McVitie, I'm being born. And it's sort of, this whole thing has, my entire life, the University of Illinois has been tied up with this whole notion of supercomputing, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. Well, McVitie came here, as they said, and became head of astronomy in 1952 and remained that way till 2001 was written. So in the year that 2001 came out, 1968, that was the year that McVitie was stepping down as the head of astronomy. George Swenson was taking over for a few years before Eco Eben Jr. Took over as department head. Eco was the head that then recruited me. I came in about 79. And then McVitie died about 10 years ago, just about, in fact, as NCSA was coming into being and a number of the other things here. So this is why Clark says Hal was born here. It was a tribute to his astronomy professor. It had nothing to do with computers. And yet, you'd think, well then, I deal with computers, what would I ever have had to do with McVitie? Well, it turns out that not only was I born the year he was teaching Clark, but then when I was an undergraduate, as many of you are, I was actually reading McVitie's textbook on cosmology because it was one of the standard texts at that time, and I am an astrophysicist. But also, Clark was in the US, which he hasn't done for a long time, making 2001. And so in about 1968, it must have been, while I was an undergraduate, Clark came to the University of Missouri, where I was an undergraduate, and I was his host, just as I was using McVitie's textbook. Now, if you think I had a clue that this was connected at all or had anything to do with my future, that's not how history really works. So, and just that time, as I say, McVitie was actually stepping down as department head. One of the nice things, just finishing on McVitie, is although he retired from the faculty in 1972, he actually did overlap coming back here with when I got off the boat in '79 as a young assistant professor. And I remember having these debates with him, of course, completely not remembering this had anything to do with 2001, on the use of computers in the study of cosmology. And at first, McVitie was quite skeptical about this, but after a certain number of the things that I had done in general relativity, using the computer to be able to do things you couldn't do with pencil and paper, the analytic way that he had always used, he actually became very enthusiastic about this. And then went back to England, and I'd really never seen him again until his death. So that's the real story of why Hal was born in Urbana. It's not nearly as interesting as the metaphorical story of why it makes sense that Hal was born in Urbana, and that's what I want to spend most of my time on. Now, to understand this, you have to understand a little bit about Clark's view of the history of computers. Arthur Clarke is a wonderful science fiction writer and one of the greatest futurists of our time. And when he's focused on extrapolating things from existing histories of technology, he's very good. But when he lets his literary flights of fancy get the best of him, then he often gets things wrong. And there's a really interesting mix here of these. Anyway, Clark says about the history of HAL in 2001, HAL was a masterwork of the third computer breakthrough. These seem to occur at intervals of about 20 years. The first had been in the 1940s when the long obsolete vacuum tube had made possible such clumsy, high-speed morons as ENIAC and his successors. This is the first generation of digital computers. I'll come back to those in a minute. Then in the 1960s, 20 years later, solid-state microelectronics had been perfected, and with its advent, it was clear that artificial intelligences, as least as powerful as man's, need be no larger than office desks, if only one knew how to construct them. Then in the 1980s, Minsky, who's a professor at MIT in artificial intelligence, and Good had shown how neural nets could be generated automatically, self-replicated, in accordance with any arbitrary learning program. So artificial brains could be grown, and by this I think he means in a software sense, in a process strikingly analogous to the development of a human brain. Whatever way it worked, the final result was a machine intelligence that could reproduce most of the activities of the human brain, but with far greater speed and reliability. So there are these three phases of the history of computers, the first two of which, roughly speaking, work out about right. The third of which Clark has been wildly over-optimistic about. So let's go back to the first one, the 40s, and in particular, let's focus on 1948. This university it's something that I don't think nearly enough people, particularly at the university, know about it, particularly the students and people that weren't here in those days. But this, before World War II, the United States was not thought of as a great power in scientific research. The focus was in Europe. But there were a number of universities in America that were absolutely first-rate, as good as anything in Europe. One of them was Urbana. And there were people here that we now have names of on buildings, like Wheeler Loomis on Loomis Lab, Roger Adams on chemistry, that were just giants in getting people to Urbana, recruiting faculty to come here, and I think during the 1920s, DuPont gave the first grant to the chemistry department or something. I mean, this was very rare. There was Berkeley and there was Harvard and Princeton and a few places, but Urbana, for this whole century, was one of the watering holes for scientific research. Well, that had a great deal to do with why Urbana has had this 50-year history. Now, 1948, a number of things happened. As we said, Clark was learning his orbital mechanics from McVitie. John Bardeen and his co-workers at Bell Labs invented the transistor, thus setting in motion the second phase of computers that Clark talked about, the solid-state revolution. And then, of course, Bardeen came here to become a professor in 1951. But one of the strangest ironies of history, or weird juxtapositions of history, occurred with regard to how the ILIAC, a series of computers, began and involving me. Now, von Neumann, for those of you who don't know, was one of the most brilliant scientists of the 20th century. And with Albert Einstein, he was one of the permanent members of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. In about 1946, he and a couple of other of his colleagues produced a paper which is sort of the seminal paper in the history of digital computing that lays out what is now called the von Neumann architecture for how most all computers are built. And so he, being von Neumann, as soon as he figured this out, decided, okay, now let's build a computer at the Institute for Advanced Study that implements these techniques. Well, the University of Illinois was actually deciding to get into these computers, which were supercomputers. They were the fastest computers available at the time. And they had various ways they might have done it, but when they heard that von Neumann was actually going to build this machine, they had written to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and saying, you know, maybe we could work together on this. Well, in a letter dated October 16th, 1948, from Robert Oppenheimer, who had, of course, led the Manhattan Project to build the atom bomb during World War II. He was now the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, where von Neumann and Einstein were. And he wrote this letter back to Illinois saying that the authors of the Princeton Project were asked whether it would be possible to build a copy of the proposed von Neumann machine. And they wrote back saying, "We are only too glad to give you our encouragement to proceed." So the idea was, instead of just making one of these machines for John von Neumann and his group, Illinois would build a machine, a copy of it, and there'd be two of them. One would be at the Institute and one would be here. And in fact, then the Defense Department came in and said, well, look, we'll pay for half of this if you'll send this out to Aberdeen. And so this became the Iliac 1 here and the Ordvac there. Well, now the letter, and I want to come back to this over and over again, was written to Louis Ridenour, who was in fact the dean of the graduate college at that time and one of the physicists that Wheeler Loomis had recruited. And we're going to see the dean of the graduate college coming around again and again, and that of course isn't just the dean of the graduate college, but it's the whole administration. But in particular, the dean of the graduate college plays a key role in all this story. So they put this committee together, and there were people on it like Nate Newmark. Well, there's Newmark Labs here on campus, who is an engineer. There were Bill Everett, whose name is on the electrical engineering building here. Abe Taub, who was one of the great mathematicians who's at Berkeley. Ralph Meagher, who was from physics, who later became the first head of the Digital Computer Laboratory, which was the entity that was built to, in 1948 to build this computer. Well, the thing that's really interesting is October 16, 1948, the date of this letter from Oppenheimer back here saying, let's do it, let's build a supercomputer, was the day I was born. Needless to say, I was not aware of the letter at the time, or how I would ever get so wound up into this strange history of the University of Illinois. Well, the Digital Computer Lab was one of the great departments here. It became a department of computer science actually in 1964, and this first computer became the Iliac 1, which at the time was the fastest computer in the world, supercomputer. It led to a series of projects which I don't have time to go into, the Iliac 2, Iliac 3. But it set in motion the notion of this campus having people who were users of computers, like I mentioned before, Taub and Everett and Newmark and so forth, working to help computer scientists design and build these computers. And then, as I said, right now, the dean of the graduate college, the administration going and helping them get the money with the president, the board of trustees and everything to make it all happen. That's exactly what we do today, 50 years later. So it is probably the most unbroken tradition this university has, and it's something that we ought to have a lot more, we ought to tell the story of a lot more often. Now during that same time in the 60s, as we move up to 1968 and the writing of 2001, of course, computer education with the Plato Project became a key part of all this. Dan Alpert, Don Bitzer, and a lot of the others got the Plato Project going. And this led to a lot of the computer music, which you're going to hear at the Cyber Gala this week with Robin and Insuk are going to be doing a whole original composition. Again, this is a tradition that goes back, in this case, 30 years at this campus. Well, by 1968, we now get to the point in this saga where Clark and Kubrick are actually writing 2001. Remember, it was a movie first and a book later, sort of the inverse of the normal way we think about doing these books, these movies. And so when they were trying to think about this, why in 1968, for instance, did it make sense? for the world's fastest computer, HAL, to be born in Urbana. I mean, that's when they got the idea, let's put it in Urbana, right? Well, at that time, once again, a very epic a moment of great historical importance was going on here at the university, and that was the beginning of ILLIAC 4. Now, ILLIAC 4 at that time was the first of many things. It was the first parallel computer. It was 64 processors. It was built here. It was the fastest computer in the world for a long time after it was designed. Dan Alpert, again, at that point, was the dean of the graduate college. He recruited Dan Slotnick. Now, Dan Slotnick, who was the head of this project, had worked with John von Neumann, and you get this continued intertwining of people. There are only a few people in the world who do this stuff. He came here and set up the Center for Computation. Once again, a center was set up by the dean of the graduate college, just as DCL had been set up by Reidenauer. This was set up by Alpert as NCSA, and the center, David Cook Center, later on were going to be set up within the graduate college. So this notion of setting these up within the graduate college is something that continues to this day. This was funded by a federal grant, in this case a DARPA grant. DARPA is the branch of the Defense Department that has funded most of the developments in computers that we have today at one time or another over the last so many decades. It was a very big grant, much like NCSA's, except probably even, well, the ILLIAC 4 in today's dollars probably cost $100 million. So it was a very big project. This grant was from Ivan Sutherland at DARPA, who was the guy at DARPA who gave the grant. Well, Ivan Sutherland, for those of you who don't know, invented computer graphics, among other things, when he was at MIT, and is one of the great people in computers. This center had in it not only computer scientists, and in particular David Cook and Duncan Laurie, Ahmed Sameh, who came here to do the software and who later formed a center here that I'll get to in a minute, but also users like Clark Bullard and Bruce Hannon and a number of other people who are still on this campus. So again, there was this mixing together of users of the computers, the computer scientists, and the administration coming together, forming a unit which was to focus on this problem. And this was creating the kind of parallel computer that presumably is going to be necessary ultimately to make something like HAL possible. That's going on in exactly 1968 when 2001 comes out. Now, did Clark know about it? Did that influence him? Hard to say. But this synchronicity of things going on in Urbana at just the time Clark does something is really fascinating. Again, I'm an undergraduate at this point, hosting Clark and reading McVitie. Well, now, there was a real interesting transition at this point because many of you may know that the ILLIAC 4 was not completed and put on this campus because of, among other things, the student riots that were happening in the beginning of the polarization of the country from the Vietnam War, and the computer was actually finished at NASA Ames behind barbed wire, where it would not be subject to the kind of turmoil that was going on in America's campuses at that time. This led, I think, to a lot of why Clark was off in his timing on 1997. We come forward from that heroic time of 68 in many ways to 30 years later. Why haven't we got intelligent computers like HAL? Okay, reasonable question. Well, one of the reasons, I think, is because this country had a lot of other things on its mind for a long time as a result of the Vietnam War. And there came to be what I called the 15-year-long supercomputer famine in American universities that started about 1968 and continued until 1985. The funding at the federal government for high-performance computers in universities basically wasted away. A lot of the federal support for scientific research and development was slowed down or even reduced. To give just one number, the number of PhDs in engineering generated in this country by 1978 was half the number in 1968. The end of the moon landing, the build down basically after the Apollo program, all these things led to a period in which supercomputing just was not something that was done in American universities. But there was another very strange thing that happened that Clark missed, which ultimately may turn around to make Clark's vision still possible. And that is that because of a lot of these things happening, the focus for computers went not to the high end, but to the low end. And one of the things that happened during that 15 years where we weren't focusing on supercomputers was the birth of the personal computer, and in particular, the microprocessor. The idea that you could build a computer on a single chip of silicon. Now, this is a really fantastic idea, and today's computers have something like 10 million parts, if you like, on a little die about the size of a half-inch square. And the number of components, or the speed of these things, double about every 12 to 18 months. And if you just take the slow rate of 18 months, that means you get a factor of 100-fold increase in speed every decade. Now, this unrelenting exponential is something that's sort of like a drumbeat in the back of this story. Because if you go back to 1948, the fastest computers could maybe do 100 multiplies in a second. But because of this doubling, in the 20 years by 68, they're now doing something, by 1968, they're doing something like 100 million multiplications in a second, 1 million times faster. And of course, it continues. So by today, you're up to something like 100 billion calculations per second. And as far as we can see, this is going to continue, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Well, so what we have now is, in 1985, which is about halfway toward this today, a very important set of events happened on this campus that will have a great deal to do with why Hal might yet be born in Urbana. First of all, the Cedar Project under David Cook was funded, and the Center for Supercomputing Research and Development was founded, the NCSA was founded, and the Beckman Institute was founded. And again, all three of these, the Dean of the Graduate College, in that time, Ted Brown, had a great deal to do with initiating them. Ned Goldwasser, who's here, had a lot to do with helping make NCSA possible in particular. And again, it was a very tight-knit bunch. President Eikenberry helped get the money for the Beckman Institute. And why did these three things matter? Well, the Cedar Project was really looking at computer architecture and how shared memory of tying together lots of these processors could create a sort of a single mind of a computer, a single memory. This is, I think, very important, and it's something that NCSA is now going to be building off in the next decade. NCSA really changed the way that supercomputers were dealt with in the country by bringing the very fastest machines into a university research environment and making them available to other university researchers or students all over the country for free, assuming that you had a project that was adequately peer-reviewed to be on the machine. This led very quickly, along with the other centers the National Science Foundation put in, to the internet, the NSF backbone, an explosion of use of the network and supercomputers to scientific visualization, to just a continued explosion, the most recent of which is NCSA Mosaic, and the whole development by its commercialization of the World Wide Web. All this happened in 10 years. Now, Clark had a role in all this, because when we had a big grand opening of NCSA at the Krannert Center, Arthur C. Clarke participated by uplinking live from Sri Lanka from his personal computer a greeting to the new center and a reference back to Hals being born in Urbana, and I don't actually have the full text of all this, but it was on a great big screen in the Krannert Center, and we didn't know what the message was going to be, and it just sort of rolled up as the letters came in across the net from Sri Lanka and were captured on the computer here and then displayed up on this terminal. It was a very exciting moment. The machine, interestingly enough, just to continue with this incredible intertwining, the machine room turned out to go in a building. What do you think the building was on campus? The astronomy building. The astronomy department was in the building that had been built for Iliac 4 and then abandoned. Iliac 4 wasn't built. They had to find another use for it, so the astronomy department moved into the building. And it was in that building that I wrote the proposal for NCSA, and that then ultimately, with Ned's help of some extra money to redo the floor that had been all curled up waiting after the Iliac 4, made it a state-of-the-art modern machine room, and to this day, that's where the supercomputers are in NCSA. Well, the Beckman Institute, the third leg of this, was founded at the same time. So we have now computer architecture with Cook's group, the actual use of this computer to develop a whole new generation of applications at NCSA. The Beckman Institute was founded by a number of the scientists on this campus to study how intelligence arose out of biological and man-made devices. Now, it's changed quite a bit, and I'll come back to its current mission later, but that's really what it was written about. And David Waltz, who was one of our top computer scientists in artificial intelligence, was one of the people that had a lot to do with writing that part of it. And this gets back to Clark's whole notion of, is artificial intelligence, neural nets, the way that we're going to learn to program computers that can become self-aware and intelligent like HAL? So this was going on about 10 years ago. Now, today, 1997, as I say, the big surprise is, after all this, where's HAL? So one of the questions is, why did Clark choose 1997 as opposed to 2010 or 2020 or something, right? Why intelligent computers in 97? And here we find Clark trapped by his literary style and ideas rather than his normal technological projection. He couldn't resist a good title. 2001. Well, now, if HAL is going to be on a spaceship off Jupiter when they discover the monolith and all of the great climax of 2001, HAL had to be built before that, right? So Arthur C. Clarke actually, in one of his later calculations, says, I dimly recall choosing 1997 because it seemed close enough to the launch of the Discovery spaceship in my novel. So in other words, it was a literary convenience, because he couldn't have very well put it, 2010 if the monolith was going to be found in 2001. So it really, again, has this sort of funny thing that he chose Urbana because of McVitie. He chose 1997 because he'd chosen the title already. But as Clarke says, 2001 as a literary work was not meant as a strict prediction, but more of a vision, a way things could work. So I want to just end by saying, well, given all this, could HAL yet be born in Urbana? And I think the chances are pretty good. Let's try to back up and figure out, first of all, when is a reasonable time to expect HAL to be born? Now, the only way I know how to extrapolate the future is by looking at technological trends. And as I said, there's been this exponential for roughly 50 years. When I wrote my book on supercomputing and the transformation of science, I studied the history of the computers, and what was really amazing to me was that if you sort of chart them, and you can't see this, but you can see there's a logarithmic chart here, over 50 years, there's basically this straight line over a trillion-fold increase in speed from World War II until today. As many of you know, the first teraflop computer, a computer able to do a trillion is a million million, 13-digit multiplies in a second, okay, has just started working at Sandia National Labs. And we'll have one here in Urbana capable of that kind of speed by 2000. So there's this sort of logarithmic projection. Well, humans are smart, and they must be able to compute pretty fast in some underlying way that supports thought, but they're not infinitely fast. And so you might ask, well, how fast is your wetware? And there's lots of folks who've tried to figure that out, and one of the most intriguing is Hans Moravec in his book from about 10 years ago called Mind Children. He's professor of robotics at Carnegie Mellon, and this is actually a book on the future of robot and human intelligence. And this is one of the few books that actually has the guts to try to figure out when computers will become as capable of as being intelligent as human beings. And if you just simply project this and you try to figure out, well, you know, we got roughly 1 trillion neurons, and each neuron roughly can do something like 100 or 1,000 calculations a second, you figure that it's basically something like 10 to 1,000 trillion operations per second must be roughly what a human brain is capable of. Well, if you're in 1948 and you're doing 100 operations a second, that's infinity. That's forever into the future. If you're 1968 and you're doing 100 million calculations instead of 100 trillion, you're still 1,000,000 times too short of the mark. So again, doesn't seem very likely. You're now in 1997, where we got 1 trillion operations. Now you're only a factor of 100 short. And you're going to get roughly a factor of 100 every decade. So as he concludes, and I certainly don't see any reason to disagree with it, somewhere around 2010, computers on their current track will become capable of as many calculations per second as the human brain seems to be capable of. Now, does that mean it'll be self-aware or can think and so forth? That's a whole other issue. But the thing I've always had a problem with in these discussions about artificial intelligence is people say, well, why can't computers today, why can't my PC, if artificial intelligence is so great, why can't it be as smart, you know, as my dog or something, or me? And the thing that's always seemed obvious to me, maybe I'm just a physicist, but it just seems to me that if you don't have a computer that's as fast as a human brain, it can't very likely be as intelligent as a human brain. Okay? Now, it might have to also do a whole bunch of other things, which are unlikely. But it seems like having a computer that's 1% as fast as your brain isn't likely to have an interesting discussion with you. All right? So, but the thing that's very interesting here is that somehow around 2010, we ought to be getting to the first supercomputer that is roughly as fast as a human brain. Now again, every factor, you know, in 1985, the supercomputer we had at NCSA is about the same speed as the Nintendo 64 that you can buy for $200 for your 8-year-old out at Kmart or Best Buy or anywhere else in town. In fact, it's very hard to buy them because they're in such demand. So in 10 years, basically, the supercomputer becomes a personal computer. So that would mean that by, say, 2030, at least, and that's pretty conservative, 2020, 2030, personal computers ought to have about the capacity of a human brain. Now, the only interesting thing there is that there will probably be about 1 billion of them. There's currently 200 million personal computers. And guess what? They're all networked to each other. So if you have 1 billion computers on a planet with maybe 10 billion humans, and the humans are talking to each other and writing and stuff like that, and the computers are networked to each other at probably at that time billions of bits per second to trillions of bits per second. Reading is about 100 bits per second. That's a pretty interesting picture. Now, furthermore, the computers are tied into all the data banks, all the sensors, all the people, all the digital libraries in the world, all the satellites in space, all the information that has ever been written about, all the music that's ever been composed. Everything is in this giant digital environment in which you have 1 billion computers as smart as people interacting with each other. So the real question then is that how? Or will it become how? And where will the software develop, and where will the understanding and the underlying technologies develop that will turn that raw computing power into intelligence? Well, I come back again to the Beckman Institute. Under Jerry Jonas, it has been reorganized into 3 main areas. One is biological intelligence. How does intelligence emerge out of this wetware? 2, the human-computer intelligent interaction. This is all the people in artificial intelligence, computer vision, and so forth, working on how that interaction occurs. And then 3, molecular and electronic nanostructures. You see, if you're going to make computers that fast, you can't make them the way we do today. You're going to have to develop new kinds of quantum devices that can be much smaller than what we have today. And those kinds of things are even biological components, because people do now talk about DNA as computers. Those are the kind of things that are studied in that part of the Beckman Institute. At NCSA, we have a new dean of the graduate college, Richard Alkier, that I report to. We'll be looking over the next 5 years at machines really with the kind of shared memory that came from David Cook's Cedar Project. We expect to get to a teraflop, to 10 teraflops, and beyond during this period. So it's likely that the computers, as they're built, and as they begin to approach the speed of human brains, will be in Urbana. You'll have the people investigating the basic research in the Beckman Institute and throughout the university. But I thought it was real interesting. If you think Hal's going to be born, say, in 2027 or something, 30 years from now, probably the father of Hal is not yet born. Because most likely it'll be someone under 30 that has the innovation to do this. Let's just hope we can get them to be a student at the University of Illinois. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions if there are any. We're not in any great hurry to get out of here. Raise your hand up because it's kind of hard to see. If we want to bring the lights up, it'd be a great help. Thanks. Yeah, Ned.
I don't know what the limit is in the speed of the human brain, but there are physical limits to what you can do with electronic devices, how much distances are won and so forth. Have you ever thought about what is the limiting factor of the human brain that establishes its speed, and how does that compare with what the limitations are with spatial data?
Right. Well, it's interesting. The brain is very slow in terms of switching because it works on chemical means instead of electronic means. And so it works on millisecond time scales, whereas computers switch on nanosecond time scales, and that's a factor of 1 million times faster. On the other hand, the brain makes up for it by having 1 trillion to 10 trillion neurons, and the neurons and the synapses have interconnections with vast number of other neurons. So the architecture of the way a brain is put together is totally different than the way computers are put together. So speed is a sort of very one-dimensional approach to the problem. It's sort of a sizing of the problem. And it may well be that if you take computers and you continue them down the line that we are, while you end up with something sort of the speed of a brain, it will have an architecture that's so different that something very other than human intelligence will emerge from it. But that it's complex enough. If you imagine a billion of these computers spread out through the world communicating at speeds vastly greater than the neurons are capable of in our brain, that it will be capable of something is pretty clear. Whether we call that human intelligence or whether we have to invent some new names for it, I don't know, but we ought to keep an eye on it. Yeah.
When we create the first intelligent computer, will we be allowed to create another one? In other words, should we actually do this type of thing? The movie can also be looked at as a warning. I mean, how it killed everybody on the spaceship. What is your opinion?
The question is, what about the warning in 2001 that if you make a computer that is more intelligent than man, he may decide that to take over? Well, my policy has always been to make computers my friend and hedge my bets. You know, at one point, cows were the sort of highest species on Earth, and then they're not anymore. And you see, we deal with cows. I don't know. But I'd think seriously about not pissing off your computer. I think that, you know, one of the things that Asimov, another great science fiction writer, wrote about was his 3 laws of robotics. And one of the issues is how do we build into the software that run on computers safeguards. And one of the most important issues we have today is the issue of security and privacy. Are we going to build computers and computer networks in which you and I as citizens in supposedly a free country are able to use them to express freedom of speech? Are we going to have Big Brother being able to go in and read or listen to whatever we do without us knowing it? Well, we're at basically the decision point in history in these few years that will decide that. And depending on how it's decided, Big Brother will either be built into the system or will be forever kept out of the system. But one or the other is going to happen. And there's a great debate over this in the industry in Washington and so forth. I don't have time to go into it, but it is something that is very good example, I think, of just this kind of concern. So eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And I think we have to keep a very close eye on these social trends of computers. You can't just assume that you let the technology go and everything will be fine. Yeah. Is going to what? Well said. Right. The parent of Hal, I suppose, would be the right way to say it. No, that's right. And it's one of the things that is unfortunate is the lack of women in computing. There's no real good reason for it, but there certainly aren't nearly the sort of 50% representation there should be. I think it's a scandal. I don't know. It's not nearly as bad as physics. I mean, I'm ashamed to be a physicist where 5% or something of the tenured faculty in the country are female. But in computers, there really is no reason for it. There's no barrier of entry, and the same goes for race or ethnicity, a lot of other things. And I think, but it is a real problem. You need to know that. And any of you who can help encourage more diversity into the ranks of people working on computers, the better off we'll all be. Yeah.
Actually, how many of the supercomputers do we have on campus now?
Well, the term supercomputer, of course, is a moving target. It means the fastest computer that you can get at any one time. So at NCSA, that's where the fastest computers on campus are. We have, I guess, 2 or 3 of them, something like that. But the ones we have that are supercomputers now, in 3 years, will be junking because they're too slow, and they cost too much to maintain. So it's a constant turnover of these machines, just as it was from when you were here with the ILAC 1.